So this talk is a little bit different than the previous talk, and I'm part of a research team. We're working on a multi-year study to develop methods of automated assessment, and we're in the process of developing and constructing the items, the assessment items themselves. And this research falls under automatic question generation or automated item generation. They're slightly different literatures, but I'm working with a team, computer scientists, computational linguists, and IO psychologists. So this falls more within the realm of kind of the corporate learning analytics, and we are consultants doing research for government agencies who have a lot of training programs that they have. So I'm going to present just a little offshoot from the larger project. I'm not going to go too much into the details of that, but one of the major challenges for automated assessment and automated item generation is controlling the difficulty of the generated items. So we focus particularly on the selection of the response options because that seems to be the most widely used method for controlling item difficulty. So just to give you an overview, I'm going to give some background on automated item generation, talk about some specific measures of item difficulty that have been used, look at the structure of the training document, which in this case was a user manual that was used in a training course, part of a research study that was ongoing, also included an item bank, and we were out looking at the comparisons between the automatically generated items, human-generated items, but that is a separate study, so I'm not going to go into that too much today. One thing I wanted to introduce is that we took the text of the training materials and represented it as a graph, as a way to examine the relationships among the keywords and terms that were used as the distractors. And then I'm going to describe an experimental study actually where we compared 3 different metrics in order to estimate or approximate the similarity between the key, the item key, and the response options. And then I'll just summarize with some conclusions. So overall, items can be generated based upon the syntax, manipulation of the syntax of the source text, the semantics, or using neural networks. And these types of automated approaches can generate a very large number of items. So in other contexts, we could say medical testing, thousands of items could be produced. In our particular context, it was really about 100, about 600 to 1,000 items generated. And one of the major issues was that the items can vary a lot in terms of quality and difficulty as well. So developing effective assessments requires controlling controlling the difficulty to rule out items that are too easy or too hard. And so in terms of the semantic approaches to AIG, past research has looked at that has represented the relationships in terms of domain ontology. So let's say high stakes medical exam testing. So in cases where an existing ontology is available, then that kind of solves part of the problem. It is more manageable that you can trace the relationships between the item keys and the distractors. But in our case, we were working with a really focused training course. We're thinking like a relatively small scale training, like 8 to 12 weeks, using a particular text, a document, which in this case was a user manual. And the items that we were thinking about here, we did not have an ontology. We did explore methods for constructing an ontology, which is somewhat arbitrary. And so we had to explore this question, like how do you select distractors when you don't have an ontology? So in this case, the items were generated from the semantics of key relationships. And what I'm going to focus on here is the relationship between a tool and a purpose. So the training that we looked at, that we're examining, is a radio. So it was a piece of equipment and the components of the radio and the functions of the different components. So it's a relationship between a tool and a purpose. And in terms of the source document, this manual was analyzed. Sorry, kind of give background. So we analyzed this manual, consisted of about 3,000 sentences. Okay, the sentences were a variety of types, and the task for the prototype that was being developed is you take some input, provide it to the system, it identifies the salient content, and from that takes the sentences and transforms them into the question stems and also the response options. So the response options are taken as words contained within the sentence. So that is the task of the larger system, and we're going to look at some of the features that contribute to difficulty. So difficulty can be measured by features of the source content, the item stem, and the response options. Here I'm referring to them as keys and distractors. And there are text-based features. We know that past research has shown that negative phrasing, passive phrasing, the readability, the stem length, and the response length all contribute to the difficulty of the item. If you are considering relational features from an ontology, you can look at similarity, connectedness, specificity, and cohesion. So these are all measures that have been used in previous research, and we did quite an exhaustive review of the literature to see which measures we could actually use. In terms of the most common approach is to look at the similarity between the keys and the distractors using different measures of similarity, and there are a number of them. So this relationship, the idea is basically that distractors that are highly similar to the key require more knowledge on the part of the learner to differentiate from the key, thus increasing the difficulty of the item. And one way of thinking about similarity, we can think about it in terms of the shared number of attributes between two keywords, entities, or concepts. So this can be measured in terms of Jacquard similarity. In our specific study, the one I'm going to describe for you, we compared 3 different approaches for distractor selection. One was class-based approach. We're selecting distractors from the same class or subclass as the key, which share similar attributes. So this was kind of analogous to an ontology, but we're trying to do this based on the structure of the text. Another approach would be a text based upon measuring the distance between the distractors and the keywords by the proximity in the text. So this is a hypothesized relationship. We're just saying that some distractors which are nearer to the key might be related to the key in some way. And then the third approach was based upon the graph representation, where we were examining the connections between the concepts and saying that distractors which are highly connected to the key, share connections in the graph, are going to be more closely related to the key and therefore more difficult to differentiate from the key. So I'll say a little bit more about this in a second. I'm showing here an example of the document sections in the user manual. So this is part of the training materials here, and you can see that we have chapter 2 represented about half of the training manual itself, and it consisted of, this is really a subsection of the entire chapter, but there we have one section on controls, indicators, and connectors, and another chapter on the operating procedure. So within this, what I'm trying to say is that the document sections revealed conceptual relations and subclass relations for helping to identify which distractors would be most closely related to the key and therefore more challenging if selected as distractors. So if I take, for example, a key, if I identify a key from the key field section here, right, the argument that we're trying to make is that those keywords and entities from within the same section will be more difficult if selected as distractors than keywords and entities selected from other types of chapters. And we represented this as a graph. So in this figure here, we converted the document of the text to a graph. First of all, starting by using the rapid automatic keyword extraction algorithm. And by parsing those text of the document, we identified a little over 1,800 keywords. That was graphed in Neo4j. And 131 of those keywords were identified as part of the tool-purpose relationship. So in terms of the structural components of the graph, what we have here is a portion of the graph depicted as a dendrogram. And at the top of the graph here, that's slightly concealed by that comment bar at the top, there's a node which just represents the entire document. And then following underneath that, we have the orange nodes represents chapter 1 and chapter 2, and then the green nodes below represent the chapter sections and subsections, coming down to the blue sections which represent the sentences themselves, and then the yellow nodes at the bottom represent the keywords. So what we're trying to do then is to measure the distance from the key, which is highlighted in red here, to other concepts in the source text that would be ideally selected, and that we could measure the difficulty or estimate the difficulty of those items here. So I'm just going to take this as an example. So if I start out with the key circled in red, those other entities here highlight that are closest to the key, those are the ones that, according to the approach, the position we're trying to argue here, would be more closely related conceptually and therefore more difficult to differentiate from the key than the other types of keywords represented in the next subsection or in a different chapter. So we're trying to say is those keywords and entities that were farthest from the key would be relatively easy to differentiate and therefore reduce the difficulty of the assessment item. So I've described these metrics and the three approaches that we were using for estimating, approximating the key distractor similarity. First, based upon the class and subclass relations from the document sections and the subsections in the user manual. Second, based upon the sentence distance, and this was just measured simply in terms of the number of sentences away of each distractor from the distractor responses. There's one other thing I wanted to mention, I forgot to mention before. Yes, there were approximately 40 distractors and that we were working from. Continue. 40 distractors for each key term, and these terms, for every key, there was approximately equal number of distractor candidates to select from. And the third thing was the difference in the relative importance of the key and the distractors as measured by the rake scores. So we had 16 automatically generated items, stated a purpose, and asked which tool achieved that purpose. The distractors were selected from that set of 39 tools, and we identified the 5 distractors that were nearest to the key and 5 distractors that were farthest from the key using for each of those 16 items. And then, in order to, in a sense, validate the distractors that were identified, we had a subject matter expert that rated the 30 distractors for each item by how closely the distractor was related to the key on a 3-point scale. The ratings range from 0 to 2. We aggregated those, creating a score on a 10-point scale, and the hypothesis again was that the distractors nearest to the key would be rated as more closely related to the key than distractors farthest from the key. Here are the findings, and the main finding was that there was a significant distance by metric interaction, and for those distractors that were identified by document section based upon the chapter subsections, that the distractors identified as nearest to the key were scored as more closely related to the key than the distractors that were farthest from the key. There was a simple main effect for sentence distance, which showed a similar effect. However, what happened here is that some distractors which were farthest from the key were also scored as closely related to the key. And then for the rake difference scores, there really was no significant effect here, and the SME did not differentiate the distractors nearest or farthest based upon the rake difference or relative importance. So these findings actually supported our hypothesis, and to summarize here, that given this automated technologies that are capable of generating very large number of stems and responses, this requires a method for selecting distractors at an appropriate level of difficulty to develop and construct effective assessments. In cases where an existing ontology is not available and the relationships are not clear, that the argument that we'd like to suggest in the approach is that the structure of the source document, in this case, provided information about the class and subclass relations for approximating key distractor similarity without an ontology. And representing the text of the radio manual as a graph revealed connections to the key that informed selection of distractors at varying levels of difficulty. So overall, the distractors from the same subsection nearest to the key scored by the SME as more closely related to the key than distractors farthest from the key, and these connections between concepts in the source text were analogous to ontological relationships and provided insights about the difficulty of the potential distractors. So this approach might be useful for people in focused training courses when an ontology is not available. Thank you.